So we are going to finish up this chapter today. Also, we'll probably have some extra time. So if you have any questions, like homework questions or things that you want to go through, we would have time to do that today. I also want to talk to you a little bit about the VITA class, the volunteer income tax class that is offered in the spring. So I'll do my sales pitch for that class, and then we'll be done for the day. We'll see how long it takes us. And if you want to, you can take these down. These aren't you, so so you can actually see the screens there. Feel free to do so. Before I get started, are there any questions about stuff that we've covered so far in chapter 1? No? Okay. Has everybody started to work on Tax Act? Played around with it? Okay. Do that. You don't want to get to the last minute and you're like, I don't know how to do this. The best way to learn that program is just to play around with it. It's honestly, all tax software is that way. You learn it through doing. I mean, you're all tech savvy. It's not like you're in your 60s and you haven't, really had a whole lot of experience. I'm not in my 60s, by the way, but I haven't had a whole lot of experience with technology. You guys can all figure stuff out. But I'm here for any questions that you might have as you go through that. But I do suggest that you, unless you're going kayaking this weekend, take a look at it this weekend, okay? So that if you have any questions, you're not waiting until the last minute and then emailing me at 10 o'clock at night and I'm not getting back to you because I'm not going to answer my emails even if I'm up at 10 o'clock at night. But I just want you to have plenty of time to be able to look that over and to become familiar with it. Believe me, you will become familiar with it by the end of the semester. You're going to have 9 of these assignments, these Tax Act assignments. So you've got 9 different clients that you're going to enter information for. So you'll become quite familiar with how to use that software. It is a software that's used by professionals. I never used it. There's tons of different types of tax software, but it is one of them. So it's not like it's some made-up software that doesn't really reflect reality. It is one that is used professionally. Okay, so nobody has any questions. We'll get this party started here. So we need to talk a little bit about types of authority with regard to taxes. So I always tell students the most common answer to any tax question is it depends. Pretty much anything. I think we talked about filing status that on Tuesday, kind of started to talk a little bit about filing status, and I mentioned that it seems like it would be an easy question to answer. Are you single? Are you married? But it's not necessarily an easy question to answer. The answer to it is it depends. What is my filing status? It depends. What is my taxable income? It depends. How are these capital gains going to be treated? It depends, right? And sometimes those questions can be rather complex. I mean, to the point where people are paid a lot of money to just answer tax questions, not even just prepare the return, but to answer tax questions. And they are complex because taxes it's law, it's tax law. These are legal questions that have to be asked. So when you get into a situation where, at least as a preparer, you're just not quite sure what the answer is, and I will tell you that is the case the vast majority of the time. Somebody asks you a question off the cuff is, it depends, I'll have to research it. So where do you go for research? How do you find that information out? Well, we've got different levels of authority and places that we can go to find out answers to questions. And I will also tell you that sometimes you don't find the answer. And so if you're really, really brave, you take a position and you cross your fingers and you hope that you don't have to argue your position to one of these sources of authority. So the three sources of authority that we look to, there's a hierarchy to them. So, and when I say there's a hierarchy, it means that if you do have to argue your case to the IRS or in front of a judge, the further down you are on these cases of authority, the more authority you have in arguing this. So we've got statutory sources, administrative sources, and judicial sources. And you'll see that what happens with each of these types of sources is they become more specific as we progress. So statutory sources, that means there's some sort of statute, some sort of law. Congress has made a law with regard to how taxes are to be administered. Now, we all know Congress. We all know that very few of them are tax experts. They do have tax experts on their staff that help them to write the laws, but if you actually read some of these laws, they can be extremely vague. And so, because they're extremely vague, we have to then proceed to some other sources of authority. Administrative sources of authority would be next. Those are regulations that are promulgated by the IRS, by the Treasury Department, and it's their interpretations of what Congress meant when they passed a particular law. So the IRS goes through and they issue these regulations, and anytime a new tax law is passed, they will issue regulations surrounding those, kind of a proactive way of addressing any issues that they may see that taxpayers may have. And it provides more explanation, but it is still their interpretation. And believe it or not, the IRS is not always right. They actually do lose in court. It's not unheard of. So when a taxpayer challenges one of these administrative sources, it goes to the next level, which are judicial sources. And the judicial sources are exactly that. They're tax cases that have been decided by either the tax court, which is a specific federal court that only deals with tax matters, and it is staffed with judges and staff who know taxes, or district court. District court is full of judges and staff that do all kinds of law. So they are not specialists. They may know about tax law, but chances are maybe they're experts in dealing more with criminal matters. Well, tax law can be, that can be a criminal matter. Or different types of civil law that they're experts in. So we've got a couple of different judicial regimes that hear tax cases, and those happen when a taxpayer has taken a position on a particular tax matter. They've said that have taken a deduction for some medical expense, and they filed their tax return. And when they were filing their tax return, they or their tax preparer read through these types of sources and took this particular position. And then the IRS came back and said, no, we disagree with you. You can't take that position. We're not going to allow this deduction. The taxpayer decides that they're going to fight the IRS on it and say, no, we have proof that through these sources that I can take this position. And that's when they'll go through the judicial process to determine what the actual, and then the judge will decide whether the actual deduction is allowable or not. Now the problem with judicial sources is they're very specific. So if you are a tax preparer and you're not quite sure about whether or not a client can, I don't know, deduct some homeopathic medical treatment on their tax return, and you go through your judicial sources to see if there have been any cases, if it's not exactly like your case, it's not exactly, these were homeopathic remedies and they were allowed, and the decision was that they were allowed to be deducted, then it's much more difficult to prove to a judge that you have an appropriate source. So the judicial sources are very specific. Administrative sources are more general, but again, those are the IRS's interpretation. And then the statutory sources are even more broad, but again, this is Congress that has written the laws. Okay, so we've got these three levels of sources that can be used. This just kind of goes through, so here's the legislative process. Anybody old enough to remember Schoolhouse Rock? When a bill becomes a law, how a bill becomes a law. So this is just like any other law. Tax law is just like any other law. And so it goes through a process of starting with the House of Representatives, gets voted on, it usually starts in a committee, gets voted on, then it goes to a Senate committee where they, decide whether they're even going to take it up or not. They ultimately, if they're going to take it up, it's voted on by the Senate, but usually in that process, things are changed, right? So the Senate bill doesn't agree with the House bill. The two bills have to match exactly, so it may go back to the House. And of course, when you've got different parties controlling the two houses, or the two chambers of commerce, or of Congress, then you have a lot more conflict between that. But ultimately, then it goes through more committees, gets refined, has to pass both the House and the Senate in exactly the same manner, and then it's signed or it's vetoed by the president, and then that's how a bill becomes a law, including tax laws. This is just kind of to give you an idea of so the Internal Revenue Code is the section of the U.S. Code, which contains all of the laws passed by Congress. The Internal Revenue Code is a part of that U.S. Code, and these are the sections within the Internal Revenue Code. Now you'll see they don't all deal with income taxes. Really what we're dealing with, you can see all these different types of taxes that the federal government regulates. Income taxes are just the first part. Now they're a big part because individual taxpayers, that's where they're mostly interacting with the taxes there. Let's see. I guess they give an example here of how the IRC, that's Internal Revenue Code, how it's organized. So for example, IRC Section 61, so this would be under Subtitle A, under income taxes, defines what gross income is. Except as otherwise provided in the subtitle, gross income means all income from whatever source derived, including but not limited to the following items. So essentially, gross income is everything unless there's an exception to it. And then it goes on to describe what those items are. Where we might come into some confusion is, okay, so here's our list in our statutory authority. Well, how do we define, like, what is exactly a dividend? Maybe you've got some sort of income that sort of meets the definition of dividend, but sort of doesn't meet the definition of dividend. And that's where you go into your further down into your sources of authority. Okay, so that's our statutory authority. Administrative authority, again, these are devised and written by the Treasury Department. Internal Revenue Service is under the Treasury Department. These are all the interpretations of the Treasury Department. So we have regulations, rulings, procedures, private letter rulings, and IRS notices. And these are kind of in a hierarchy as well. So these regulations are items that are the IRS's direct interpretation of the code, exactly what they think Congress meant when they wrote the law. They talk about these 4 different types of regulations. You can read through that if you want or not. Then we come to what are called revenue rulings and revenue procedures. So revenue rulings, the IRS is reacting to an area of the law that is confusing to many taxpayers or that has substantive implications for numerous taxpayers. So they've zeroed in, maybe they've gotten a bunch of questions on this one area of the law. So they're going to zero in on that one area and talk more at length about it and give more detail about what they think their interpretation is of that area. After many taxpayers have requested additional guidance on a given situation, the IRS may issue what's called a revenue ruling. So, which in a revenue ruling, it lists a factual situation, the relevant tax authority, and the conclusion that the IRS came to with regard to how taxpayers should treat that issue. Revenue procedures are proactive. So these are responding, they're responsive, these are proactive. The procedures, I guess you could remember that with the pro. It illustrates how the IRS illustrates how they want something reported. So they maybe haven't had so many inquiries about it or issues, but they want to be proactive about telling taxpayers and tax preparers how they want particular situations to be handled. They give us so here's an example. After the Tax Reform Act of 1986, depreciation methods changed in a big way in 1986. So the allowable depreciation methods were drastically changed. They issued a procedure to help taxpayers and preparers to properly calculate under the new rules. So those procedures, again, procedures, proactive, rulings, reactive, PR. Good way to remember it. They've got other pronouncements. Private letter rulings are rulings that they issue to specific taxpayers. A taxpayer has written to the IRS and they want a determination from the IRS before they take a position so that they know that it will be acceptable. Last I knew, to request a private letter ruling cost $500. So generally speaking, most individual taxpayers don't request those. Maybe corporations or companies or wealthier taxpayers. But if they think they're going to take, rather than go through the whole rigmarole of a position being denied and having to fight it, they want to be proactive and ask for guidance directly from the IRS. Of course, that takes manpower away from the IRS because they're going to have to go through and analyze it. So that's why they charge for those private letter rulings. Again, as it mentions here, it has limited authority because it deals with one specific question that one taxpayer asked. May or may not apply to other taxpayers, but oftentimes it's so specific that it's really not gonna apply to anybody else. So that is of limited authority when you're looking for the answers to a question. Doesn't mean it has no authority. It may guide you in the right direction, and all of those are public. You can read these on the IRS website. Let's see. IRS notices as well. Just various information that, so when there's a change in rate or an allowance, so something has changed, like every year the mileage reimbursement rate changes. And so they'll send out a notice saying that the change has occurred, or the tax brackets change, or the phase out ranges change. They'll send out a notice indicating that those have changed. Those really there's really nothing too substantive about those. They're just kind of a, hey, FYI, everybody. Then we've got the judicial authority. So as I mentioned, so this is a pretty good illustration of how the courts are set up. So mainly what we're talking about with regard to tax law are district court cases or U.S. tax court cases. These are the ones where it's the judges specifically, they know their tax. They're like a tax attorney. They know about the tax law. Both of these can go to, and then the Court of Federal Claims, I'm not quite sure. Not as much is done with that, so I don't know as much about the U.S. Federal Court of Claims. But both of these have courts of appeals then for those who are dissatisfied with the result, and ultimately those cases can go to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's pretty rare for the Supreme Court to actually issue or agree to take a tax case. It's not unheard of, but it is rare. In fact, I think the case, I can't remember the name of the case now. The one that struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, which had said, Defense of Marriage Act had said that defined marriage as one man and one woman in the U.S. That was struck down as unconstitutional. I believe that the source of that court case actually was a tax issue. If I remember right, which I don't always, but I think that was a tax issue. But like I said, so they can be consequential, but you don't really see tax cases too terribly often at the U.S. Supreme Court. But they do accept appeals. So the answer to that is true. All right, so 8 questions about that. Mainly what I want you to get out of it is there are 3 sources of authority, statutory, and they're kind of progressive, statutory, administrative, and then judicial. Ultimately, judicial is going to decide individual tax issues. That will be the final say if it gets to that point. But these sources of authority are very useful to tax preparers. If you do a lot of taxes, usually what you do is you subscribe to a research, like Westlaw or Thomson Reuters will provide like a research library where you can access, now you can access this stuff separately, you can Google it, but these packages make it a lot easier to access the information. So if you get clients who come in, and by the way, if you're interested in preparing taxes, the real money to be made is in advising. Preparing is great, but people want proactive information. They want to know that you can help them to make decisions on what to do, not to tell them what the result is of what they've already done, right? That's where this research comes in really handy because that allows you to do that. All right, questions? You didn't know you're all going to become lawyers, did you?